Good evening and welcome. I'm Matt Harkins, the director of the Literary Arts Institute of the College of St. Benedict, and I'm here to briefly introduce our guest, Joyce Carol Oates. Before we continue, I'd like to ask you to please turn off your phones in preparation for our reading tonight, and also please no recording or photography. After the reading, we will have a question and answer session, and I invite you to use the microphones that will be at the foot of each aisle. There will also be books and a broadside for sale in the lobby, and Joyce will be available to sign both her books and the broadside. I'd like to thank our campus co-hosts who have made tonight's visit possible: the CSB SJU Libraries, the St. John's University Chair in Critical Thinking, the English Department, and Fine Arts Programming. I also want to thank Manitou Fund for its generous financial support. This is the point in a conventional introduction when I would mention the books our visiting writer has written. But as many of you know, Joyce Carol Oates has published over 100 books since 1963. Let's do that for a minute. Thank you. And a round of applause for the next bit too, which is over 40 of them have been chosen by the New York Times as a notable book of the year. So. Her writing includes novels, short stories, plays, poetry, and essays. In 2018 alone, she published 3 books, a collection of short stories titled Beautiful Days, a second short story collection titled Night Gaunts and Other Tales of Suspense, and the novel Hazards of Time Travel. Among her many honors, she has won the National Book Award, as well as 2 O. Henry Prizes, the Penn Malamud Award for Excellence in Short Fiction, the Penn Center USA Award for Lifetime Achievement, the Poets and Writers Distinguished Lifetime Award, as well as the National Humanities Medal. Economic exploitation and the violence inherent in racism surface repeatedly in her work, as does the way women try to make their way through cultures that wish to control them. She has explained that, quote, "It's a rare story or novel of mine that doesn't involve a crime of some kind, often a long-buried secret. Mystery is close to the heart of our experience as human beings. We are always trying to figure things out, to comprehend why," unquote. And I will leave you with one example of such a crime. In a story from the book Beautiful Days titled The Memorial Field at Hazard, Minnesota, a future president, elderly and with a failing body, is pulled from a hospital to visit an 800-acre marshy field filled with thousands of bodies that have been shipped there from around the world. This future president is hazy about the details. He knows he has been sentenced to dig up each grave by hand and to be photographed with each body. He does not fully comprehend why this must be so, why he alone must carry the burden of all these deaths, since he was only fulfilling what he saw as the mandate of the electorate. The guilt, as he sees it, is collective. Quote, "The memorial field at Hazard is our final resting place. In the memorial field, our solid bodies yield to liquid, and when the liquid dries, to dust. The photographs are taken one by one, for we must die one by one, as we are born one by one, for we are singular and not plural. And the truth is to know the one is not the many, and the many is not one, but the one can be as great as the many. The former president is grinning amid the dead. He grips a shovel in one hand, and in the other, the partially decayed hand and arm of a young child. It is the first of the children. It will not be the last. He must crouch down into the grave. He must embrace the broken body as his own." Unquote. Would you please join me in welcoming our guest, Joyce Carol Oates.
Thank you so much. I was standing backstage trying to hear this wonderful introduction. I heard some applause now and then. I couldn't actually hear most of it. So I don't know what Matt said, but I was just hoping that it was really very sweet and generous. Well, I've had the most wonderful time. I have been here 3 days. I think people have been seeing me. It probably feels like 6 months that I've been here. I've been taken out to lunch. I've met so many wonderful students. I'm just extremely impressed with how articulate and intellectually curious people are, and a kind of interesting admixture of majors along with being interested in English and creative writing. It's really thrilling. So I've had a great time. I've been posting photographs of all your snow to my friends elsewhere, including back in Berkeley. And they said, "Joyce, it's very beautiful there, but don't go outside." So, I mean, some of them seemed really worried that I would be outside running around or something. But I've been looking out through my window, and it's just been very, very impressive. And it hasn't actually been that cold here. I know it's probably going to start around midnight and be kind of a devastation. However, I may be gone by that point. So I have had a wonderful time, and I have brought some material to read. I'm going to start reading from a new work. It's fairly quite new. And then I will read a broadside, which is a wonderful book designer has done for this book and the hazards of time travel. If I have a little time, I'll read from that novel, but I probably will not be, having too much extra time. And then I look forward to having questions from the audience and having a kind of conversation. I have received wonderful questions in the last couple of days, and I'm still leaving, sort of mulling, and these wonderful, provocative and stirring questions have been sort of lingering in my mind. So I think to know the kind of questions to ask is really so imaginative. The first piece I'm going to read is quite short, and people have asked me in the classes I've met about the occasions for writing, like why do you write certain things and where do you get your ideas? I'm often asked that question. Stephen King says he gets his ideas in a pawn shop in Utica, New York. He just sort of goes in and gets them. It's the question writers are most often asked. And it is a good question, but it's almost impossible to answer. There are many, many questions and many, many inspirations and ideas and fixations and obsessions that kind of whirl around our heads all the time, like gnats, or mosquitoes. But most of them just sort of are fleeting and transient. And yet there are some that are becomes really important to us and lodge deeply in the heart. So where do we get our ideas? I'm not sure that we get them. It's almost that the ideas come to us. So I was invited by the New York Times Magazine to participate in a feature that they had about, I think, childhood and incidents from childhood that made a strong impression on us. I grew up in a small farm in upstate New York in the Snow Belt area. But I think it's somewhat competitive with this area. But we thought of ourselves as a snow belt. And I'm not sure what you could call it around here, but probably there's more snow here. So I grew up in a small farm, which was not a very prosperous farm, but we did not know it. I was the first person to graduate from high school in all my family, including relatives, and it was a fairly large family. My parents both went to 8th grade, and then they had to drop out. It was a depression, and they wanted to work. In those days, you would say proudly, or a bit incredulously, of somebody that he has a high school education. You know, that was considered like a real achievement. And beyond that would be college and university, but that wasn't really very commonly experienced. It was quite uncommon. And so this farm that I grew up on, while it wasn't prosperous, we did not really know that. And we didn't know that we were relatively poor people, I suppose. In those days, which is so long ago, you will shudder if I tell you it was before the internet. It's before the cell phone. I know, before video games. It was actually before the electric typewriter, which tells you how long ago it was. But people didn't, I think, compare themselves with one another so much because there wasn't this ubiquitousness of social media. So people more or less had their own worlds. And when I was much more grown up, my mother and I were talking about this, and she said, "Oh, we never thought we were poor because we were very happy and we were no different from anyone else." And I think that the resentment and jealousy that arises in a sense of competitiveness through social media and other ways of making people uneasy and making people feel dissatisfied with themselves has a lot to do with a consumer culture and making people want to consume things that make them happy or make them more complete. But in those days, none of this was really that important. So what I wrote is called Mr. Rooster. I was in charge of the chickens on this farm. And actually, in case nobody knows what a rooster looks like, I've actually brought a picture here. And this is the sort of belligerent, but a very small brain look, you know, with a angry ferocity, a handsome, preening ferocity with a very small brain. So the idea of the male animal generally. But Mr. Rooster and his hens, a whole flock of hens, were my responsibility. So when I was a really little girl, quite little, I would go out and feed the chickens a couple of times a day with the seed, and I would run out and had this false sense of being popular, you know, that, oh, they really like me, they're all rushing toward me. If I had not grown up on a small farm among animals, I think I would just have lost so much of my life. This whole spiritual dimension and the emotional support and just the love that passes between people and animals is really, really difficult to talk about in serious literature. It can be approached quite delicately, I think, in children's literature, because animals can speak and animals can talk and have agency. But in adult literature, it's a little hard to give the personalities that creatures have, to suggest that's very difficult. So this little memoir piece is called Mr. Rooster, and it originally appeared in the New York Times in probably a different form. I do a lot of rewriting after I see something in print, that I rewrite it, so it's a little different. Mr. Rooster. The behavior of barnyard roosters, replicating the more belligerent, strutting, preening, aggressive, macho behavior of many male creatures, was a source of endless fascination and trepidation to me as a young child growing up on a small farm in the North Country of Western New York State. Now, very far Western New York State is really Midwestern. It has much more allegiance to the Midwest than it does to New York City. First of all, the obvious. Our Mr. Rooster was a gorgeous bird. He was a Rhode Island red who, in my affrighted child's eye, was nearly my height. His tail feathers were spectacular, burnished red-brown, red-maroon, golden red that shone in the sun. His comb was erect and rosy red. His rough feathers were full and bristling. His scaly, sinewy legs carried him swiftly to his target. His beak was sharp, and his prowess must have been enabled by tough neck muscles, like those of a woodpecker. Most uncanny were Mr. Rooster's sharp, suspicious eyes that squinted at me in the instant before he rushed at me to peck at my bare legs and hands. For a long time, it was my hope that Mr. Rooster would like me, and I would not rush to peck me as soon as he saw me. Was this a childish and outlandish wish, not to be pecked with no provocation? Let us think of such a wish as a cornerstone of all ethics. In order that I can be protected from your violence, let me try in whatever ways I can, with whatever strategies in my possession, to induce you to like me. Let me try to suggest to you that what is, quote, good behavior on your part that would lessen your propensity to peck at me until I bleed. It was the great thrill of my childhood when, as a child, 8 or 9, I was given the responsibility of gathering eggs from the nests in the coop and feeding our little flock of 40-odd chickens under the tutelage of my Hungarian grandmother. I should say parenthetically, my Hungarian grandparents owned a small farm, and my father and mother and I were living there. It was a time when families did sort of move in together because people were very poor in the Depression, or maybe at the very end of the Depression. And my Hungarian grandmother came to this country when she was 18 years old, but she considered that was too late for her to learn how to read or write English. I mean, that fact just amazes me. At the age of 18, it was considered that maybe it was a little too late. My grandfather could read a little bit of English, and he could sort of skim the newspaper, but heaven knows what he was reading. Who knows what he was actually reading, what he got out of it. Such a difference today. A person of 18 is really just sort of can be just beginning an education. In those days, it was sort of for some people the end. Chicken feed consisted of small kernels of corn that exuded a flourish, dusty, pleasant odor. It was purchased in a hefty cotton cloth, 20-pound bag with a decorative pattern to make it suitable for refashioning as skirts or blouses for girls. I'm sure you have a whole shiver of envy of what it might have been like to go to school in some chicken feed bag that was slightly refashioned. I remember making something myself with a gathered skirt with it, like you just sort of put thread through it, and then you pull it and make a gathered skirt. There's nothing else to it. Those days, I'm nostalgic for my lurid past. But in the barn, it had to be secured in a larger canvas sack to keep out rodents. Rodents is sort of a fancy word. I think I mean rats and mice. To get the seed, you lowered a pan deep into the feed sack, and from out of this pan, you distributed feed in zestful handfuls while calling out in a high-pitched voice, chick, 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 chick. I'm sure people in the audience can do even better than that. It's the way you call the chickens from time immemorial, and they come running. Chickens came rushing and clucking to peck in the dirt around my feet. All our chickens were free range, though the expression did not yet exist in the 1950s. Lots of expressions didn't exist in the 1950s, like domestic violence. Date rape was not heard of. I don't mean the actual event. I mean just the thought of it or the terminology. But domestic crimes didn't really exist. All these words that have come into consciousness in subsequent generations did not exist. So free-range chickens, that didn't exist. Chickens were always just ranging around quite freely. And they made messes all over, too. It was just sort of part of the landscape. We didn't know any better. This seed you scattered in concentric circles, trying not to concentrate too much seed in one area, where the more aggressive chickens would converge and contend with one another in a maelstrom of clucking and wing flapping. There is no activity like feeding chickens more conducive to making a young child feel important, powerful, and popular. Though even a very young child soon understands that the frenzied chickens have not the slightest interest in her, but only in the seed that she has tossed to them. Prowling out in the cornfield, Mr. Rooster came rushing as soon as he heard the call, knocking aside the hens in his eagerness to get to the seed. Sometimes in the midst of gobbling, he might glance up at me and decide to rush at me and peck my bare knee with his beak. Who knew why? Comical as this sounds, this attack came frequently. Yet it was always surprising to me and astonishing. I never seemed to escape in time, as if, despite my experience, I could not believe it was really happening. Why was Mr. Rooster so hateful to me? Why was the rooster's beak so swift, so sharp, and so mean? Yet more cruelly, Mr. Rooster sometimes chased me across the yard, squawking and flapping his wings. If I ran fast enough, I could escape into the house. If not, he pecked me amid a flurry of wings, drawing blood. If my Hungarian grandfather was around, he mostly just laughed. The terror of children in that long ago time was not taken seriously. If sufficiently annoyed, my grandfather might give the squawking rooster a kick into the air. And yet, I adored Mr. Rooster. That Mr. Rooster was hostile to me, nothing like my pet Happy Chicken, I had a pet chicken called Happy Chicken, who would snuggle against me and allow me to stroke her back and wings, even to kiss her hard, feathered head, did not make me admire Mr. Rooster less. Where the smaller, plainer, red-brown hens were predictable in their behavior, usually timorous and boring, Mr. Rooster was unpredictable and anything but boring. In the midst of preening his feathers, he might suddenly turn upon an unsuspecting hen and peck her savagely. He might leap up into the air with a dazzling accuracy to swallow a fly. With much commotion, he might flap his way into the lowermost limb of a tree to perch and doze. Mr. Rooster was ceaselessly hungry on the prowl for a treat, and Mr. Rooster was ceaselessly belligerent on the prowl for a fight. The rooster is the very icon of male vanity. If he knew how only a minuscule percentage of male chicks were allowed to live, 99% of them squashed to death within seconds after hatching, such a fact wouldn't fill him with existential horror, but with a confirmation of his own assured destiny. I am he who is chosen to exist. From Happy Chicken, as from numerous beloved pet cats, I learned to love creatures unlike myself and to inspire in them what felt like affection for me, a little girl. From Mr. Rooster, I learned a more complex lesson, that there are those who will never love me, nor even like me, who might, at the slightest provocation, or no provocation at all, try to hurt me. This simple, intransigent fact, nothing we can do or say will placate those who are determined to dislike us. Indeed, they might well like to squash us out of existence to make more room for themselves. As a little girl, I ran crying to my grandmother to ask, "Why does Mr. Rooster hate me?" And my grandmother told me in her heavily accented English, "Don't be silly. The rooster doesn't hate you. He is just a rooster. Always you should know that is what roosters do." My grandmother lacked the knowledge to have explained, the rooster is hardwired to blindly attack. It is his instinct. She could not have said, to allow us to behave other than instinctively like a brute creature, that is the purpose of education, of morality, and civilization. So for those of you who still don't know what a rooster looks like, this is... So it was actually one of the painful lessons of my life, As my grandmother said, no, it's nothing to do with you, that's what roosters do. And rather than be upset by it, just try to come to terms with it. So, and the poem, this is a prose poem I'm going to read. I'm sort of moving into discussing my novel, Hazard of Time Travel. In its original form, I was working on it since about 2011, off and on. It was called Vicissitudes of Time Travel. I was explaining to a class this afternoon of creative nonfiction that if you're being published, sometimes you have to have words that are understandable to people. So Vicissitudes of Time Travel was a perfect title for me, but when the publisher looked at it and considered it, it was thought that the word vicissitudes would be such a stumbling block that literally nobody at all would ever read the novel or ask for it. They say you can't have a title of a novel or any book if people can't pronounce it, they won't go into a bookstore. And maybe if they can't spell it, they won't know how to find it on Amazon. So Hazards of Time Travel. My novel, if any of you have looked at it or read it or read about it, it's set in a kind of never land. It is a novel about time travel, but not to the future. People who are punished for being intransigent and nonconformist, for questioning the state, for being dissidents. Sometimes they're deleted or vaporized or executed, but sometimes they're sent in exile to be repatriated, and they might be sent back to Wisconsin. Now, I sent them to rural Wisconsin because I had not yet been to rural Minnesota. Because the name St. Cloud does appear in my novel because I thought it was a beautiful name. Something about the idea of St. Cloud, that there's a vaporous sort of unpredictably shaped, sculpted-looking entity, that's up in the sky. Something wonderful about St. Cloud. However, I had yet to be here. And so I set it in Scotia, Wisconsin, which is an invented place, not unlike places in actual Wisconsin. So the people in the novel who are not executed for being dissidents, sent back to this place. It's called the Happy Place. And my French publisher is going to translate it into the Happy Place as a title. Because Hazards of Time Travel, too, maybe didn't seem like the right title for them. They said with a little shudder, people will think it is science fiction, and then they won't buy the book. But if they think it's something else, they'll have some other reason for not buying the book. The writers are scurrying around trying to anticipate, like, what is the reason they won't buy this book? You never quite figure that out. So in this world, I wanted to explore the consequences of the psychology that was a reigning psychology for decades in the United States, very pragmatic and manipulative psychology we call behavioralism. Most of my novel deals with the work of B.F. Skinner, and you've probably all heard of Skinner, and if you've taken psychology, you've studied Skinner. I'm actually married to a person he's not 300 years old, but when he was a freshman at Harvard, he studied with B.F. Skinner, the great psychologist, in his senior years, I think just before Skinner retired. So there's sort of a handshake connection with the great Skinner. So there was a time in our history when Skinner was considered a greater psychologist than Freud. Freud was never, or has never been considered a scientist anyway, but behavioral psychology is a science in a way that there are experiments that are actually worked on and can be replicated. It's a science, it's a hard science perhaps. Psychology of a social science and psychoanalytical psychology don't really lend themselves to experimentation, and so we don't think of them as hard science. The American psychologist who predated Skinner is John Watson, and I'm sure you've all studied John Watson. He's considered the father of American psychology. There's something very ominous about the fathers of anything, I think, what horrible thing do these people do, that we're going to find out as time goes on. And that's so true with these people. So if you have studied Introduction to Psychology, you have all heard of Little Albert. Little Albert is a famous or infamous psychological experiment done in the times before there were ethical ground rules for experimentation. Now, to be a research scientist in the United States, you must obey certain ethical laws. You can't just go out and do any kind of horrific thing to people. So first I will read the prose poem, and then maybe later, if you have questions, I'll talk about it a little bit. So this is several pages long. It's more like a narrative poem. And it's in little stanzas. Little Albert is speaking posthumously. And the little stanzas, I'll just break a little bit between them. So anyone in the audience who's a poet, you know that the spaces are very important. The white spaces on the page and where you break a line have a kind of music or rhythmic feel to them. And so a poet usually in reading makes little pauses. Little Albert, 1920. I was little Albert, 9 months old in the famous film, in a white cotton nightie on a lab table, sitting upright facing a camera. Remember me? Sure, you do. First, you saw that I was a curious baby. You saw that I blinked and stared with all the intensity of an infant brain, eager to suck into its galaxy of neurons all of the world. You saw that I was you. You saw that I was a fearless baby. You saw that I was not frightened of a burning newspaper held before me at alarmingly close range, though indeed my rapt infant face expressed the classic wariness of our race. Next, you saw I was not frightened of a frisky monkey darting close about me on a leash. You saw that I was not frightened by a large dog brought close to me, nor by a quivering rabbit, nor a small white rat, nor even a Santa Claus mask worn by a menacing male figure clad in white, shoved close to my infant face. Oh, you saw that I was attracted to the small white rat. You saw that I reached out to touch the small white rat. And as I reached for the small white rat, behind my head came an explosion of noise. The shock of it sent me sprawling, cringing, face contorted in terror, mouth a perfect O of anguish, howling. As the experimenter John Watson struck a mental pipe with a hammer, oh, what a shock, how terror rushed through me, how desperately I crawled to escape, almost falling off the edge of the table, except adult hands restrained me. And this is italicized stanza. Children naturally fear loud noises. Children naturally fear surprises. Children naturally fear the unknown. Children can be taught to fear the known. The second experiment was 1 month later. No escape for me, for I was little Albert, grim as a little gargoyle in white cotton nightie, able to sit up, though now wary and distrustful. No joy in my little body as, again, a small white rat was introduced to me. You saw how this time I shrank away, how this time there was terror in my face, how this time I did not reach with infant eagerness for the small white rat, for I learned to fear and hate the small white rat. And again, you saw how the very presence of the small white rat precipitated a deafening clamor as John Watson, another time, struck a metal pipe with a hammer again and again and again behind my head. For who was there to stop him? In this way, establishing on film how, parenthesis, baseless fear can be instilled in a subject where fear had not previously existed, and how memory of this baseless fear will endure contained in the unfathomable brain. Oh, how I cried and cried as if I'd known that my mother had received but $1 for the use of me in John Watson's psych lab, in an experiment that would destroy me and make John Watson famous. For in the alchemy of my brain, my fear of a small white rat had become generalized. And now, as Watson ably demonstrated, I feared the monkey, the dog, the rabbit equally, though each was unaccompanied by a hammer. Now I feared the menacing figure in the Santa Claus mask, as if understanding that Santa Claus was my tormentor. Cried and could not be consoled. Even a woman's fur coat terrified me. For how could I trust softness? Sudden movement, sounds behind my head, the unexpected. Italicized stanza. Classic Pavlovian conditioning, bedrock of behavioral psychology, brilliant pioneer, John Watson. Oh, you are wondering, did John Watson decondition me? No, he did not. Did another experimental psychologist decondition me? No, he did not. Ask me what was the remainder of my life. Ask me, did I adjust to life after the infamous experiment? Ask me, did I overcome my terror of animals? The answer is not known, for I died of hydroencephalitis at age 6. All this was long ago. Well, things are different now. John Watson would not be allowed to terrorize little Albert in his famous experiment now. Ours is an ethical age. Or was it all a bad dream? Were you deceived? Oh, you were little Albert. You were conditioned to fear and hate. You were conditioned to thrust from you what you were meant to love. You were the victim. You were the experimental subject. You were little Albert who died young. If you're curious about that, you could just type in Google "Little Albert." You can see the famous films, the bedrock of Pavlovian conditioning, and from that experiment onwards, we replicated many times. You teach children to fear and be terrified of things that are a little different from themselves. The idea of controlling people's minds. Hypnotizing them and brainwashing them in ways we call it classical conditioning. Now, people can be deconditioned, but it's very difficult. It's very difficult. When people who belong to a cult, their brains are literally altered. I'm not talking just about ideas. Brains are literally, and the neurons are altered by experiences like this. They're like experiments. Some countries, some totalitarian countries, literally brainwash people. They subject them to methods of torture. What was done to little Albert was pretty close. Well, it was child abuse, obviously, but it was actually a kind of torture. His brain was afflicted irrevocably, and John Watson never even thought about deconditioning him. It's really a very sordid part of American science, but important to understand. John Watson is also what we call the father of American advertising. The idea that you create visual ads in which you put components of human beings, maybe the bodies, using female bodies sometimes, using beauty, sometimes a pretend doctor in a white coat smoking a cigarette. There were ads like that. In other words, the idea that you're advertising consumer goods by using psychological methods of a pretty clever and subliminal type, showing a beautiful woman by a car, meaning if you buy the car, this woman in some weird way comes with it. And focusing on things that are flaws in people's faces and bodies, suggesting that some sort of makeup or shampoo or some physical thing, that an entity that you can pay money for, that will make you complete and give you happiness. All that really goes back to John Watson, not saying that somebody else wouldn't have thought of it in any case, but John Watson is considered the father of that. Now, in my novel, as I said, people are sent back to this other dimension, which I've sort of symbolized by being in the 1950s. The 1950s was a time, most people in the audience probably were not at all, even conceive, not even beginning to be alive at that point. But it's contiguous with our time now, in the sense that there's nothing discontinuous with it, and yet everything seems really very, very changed. The roles that women and girls were expected to fulfill have totally changed. When I'm at in a college situation, as I was for the last couple of days here, I'm so struck by the articulate nature of the young people, the students, who are able to articulate ethical questions, questions of technique and writing. And the idea that at one point in our history, our common history, that really only male students would be allowed in the predominant outstanding universities, like the predominant Ivy League universities, were all male. That idea now seems so outrageous to us. And yet it wasn't that long ago when women and girls had very different ways of life. Colleges that were single-sex colleges recognized early on the advantages for particularly women to have an academic and intellectual environment in which they weren't thrown into this competition. Because in those days it was considered if a woman didn't want to be a housewife and mother, and didn't want to maybe be a kindergarten teacher or a grade school teacher, that there was something really wrong with her. To aspire to be a doctor, a lawyer, to be a university professor, university president, I mean, just to aspire to anything like that would be considered really eccentric and radical. There were women's colleges in those days, but they tended to have male presidents, of course. So I'm going to read a broadside, a wonderfully designed broadside by Gaylord Shanelek. I hope I pronounced that carefully. Gaylord Shanelek. And there are 225 copies. It's particularly designed for my visit here. And it's very elegant and austere, like your landscape in the winter. This is like a prose poem that Gaylord discovered near the end of the novel and sort of extracted it. The young woman in the novel is someone with whom we can identify. She had been valedictorian of her class, but in this semi-future world, which is much more of a kind of exaggeration of the world that we're in right now, she asked the wrong questions about the war on terror, about the fact of history, and what science might tell us about, say, climate change and things like that. She's asking questions that the government at that time in the future doesn't want anybody to ask. And so for that reason, she's sent into exile, and she's punished in different ways. It's really her will, her morality, her spiritual nature that's beaten down, but never really extinguished. What is gradually a little bit eroded is her memory. Attacking someone's memory and taking away memory is a way of beating down free will and controlling the personality. However, she does continue, though she's lost some of her memory at the end of the novel, she's still alive and she's still questing. So this was arranged, it's prose in the novel, but it's been arranged like prose poetry here. For a long time then I was sick. It might have been weeks, months, for there were intervals of wakefulness followed by periods of forgetfulness. For there was not what could be called a steady recovery. There was not a steady progress. It was more like switchbacks in a trail. With painful slowness, you make your way forward only to find yourself switch back, facing the direction you'd come from. In such a way, time turns back upon itself. You believe that you are making progress, but it is an illusion. Yet, even this is progress of a kind. Thank you. So my novel does have a kind of happy ending. I'll just read the very end. She has really forgotten where she's come from. She's lost her family, she's lost her parents, who she loved very much. They've been extinguished in her mind, but she's determined to survive. She falls in love to some degree with somebody who has no idea who she is, but he seems to love her. And that's a fact that many people will experience. Somebody will fall in love with you, based upon some illusion that you've presented to this person, but maybe that's okay, because you're probably falling in love with the fantasy of that person too. But somehow, even with this, I'm not being skeptical or cynical, I'm just sort of saying that this kind of ways of strategies of survival that people will make in their lives are not contemptible, just to be alive. If you've had any great losses in your life, you'll know that just to sort of pick yourself up after you've been knocked down, you might not be graceful, you might not walk with your head high, but you get up, you know? And basically that's very, to me, that's heroic. So she's made her way, and now she's living at Heron Creek Farm. She has a family of a kind, and she's married. And she says to us, anytime you're in the neighborhood of Heron Creek Farm, or anywhere in the vicinity of Westcosia Falls, Wisconsin, you're welcome to drop by here with all of the others, of course. Please come. I would so like to meet you. Stay with us as long as you like. Well, thank you, and I will be happy to try to answer the questions that you have. One of the issues in my novel is the debate about free will, whether your mind can be so manipulated that you lose your free will. And I think that's a debatable question, that poor little Albert had lost, because he was manipulated and conditioned at such a young age, at 9 months, he really had no free will. He would always be in terror, not only of the white rat, but the other animals, and then he was also afraid of a woman's fur coat. And I thought probably that if he had lived to be older, he might have been afraid of women, he might have been afraid of any kind of softness, that this issue of his volition was sort of extinguished. But for most of us, we're not conditioned in such an extreme way, and I think we have some residue of free will, and it is very much related to how much we know, how much education we have, how much reading we do. Every time you read a book, every time you take a course, every time you're challenged by your professor and by your fellow students, you really are expanding your consciousness, and I believe expanding your volition and your free will. When people are very shrinking back into their own worlds and they're not really breaking out and meeting other people or traveling, then their free will just shrinks also. So that's one of the themes that I've often been working with. Does anybody have any questions about anything? I can't see too well because it's...
It's on. Oh, there it is. I'll break the ice. I have noticed, thank you so much for being here. It's great to have someone of your talent in our state. I've noticed in a couple of your novels, specifically The Tattooed Girl and The Falls, that the female protagonist was pretty unlikable. And I wondered if that was intentional or I just didn't happen to like the character.
Well, The Tattooed Girl is really a novel about the consequences of hate speech, and in that case, anti-Semitism. So there is a man who is wrongly considered to be Jewish. His father was Jewish, but his mother wasn't Jewish. So he does have his father's name, which sounds like a Jewish name. However, he's interested in Jewish history, and he's in many ways like a secular Jew, but he's literally not Jewish. However, because we want a foil for that, to examine the consequences of hate speech and anti-Semitism, a girl comes into his life who's been very conditioned by her background. She comes from a family that's ignorant, that are like white racists, white supremacists, people who are anti-Semitic. So she comes to him conditioned to, quote, hate Jews. But then when she gets to know him, as the novel goes on, near the end of the novel, she sees him as an individual, and she thinks that I love him, that he is Jewish. I love him. So my novel is really moving to that point. Now, that you didn't like her in the beginning is certainly understandable, because she's not likable. in the beginning, but a novel takes characters through trajectories, so she changes. And at the end of the novel, she's literally punished for her change of heart. She does love him, but it's late, it's too late, and she's punished in a very extreme way for the anti-Semitism she had expressed much earlier in her life. Okay. Other questions?
The other one I asked about was the falls. I just wondered about that protagonist.
You mean
Because I loved the novel, but I didn't like the character.
Well, you know, sometimes we don't like characters, or people who maybe don't like Macbeth or King Lear. I mean, I'm really sorry that you didn't like the character. But maybe I'll go back and change the character a little. To me, she was a woman trapped in a situation in the 1950s. She's married to a man she thought she loved, and he didn't really love her. He was secretly, and perhaps unconsciously, gay. The word gay didn't exist. So he marries her to seem to be a normal man, and she's victimized by the fact that she thinks she loves him. He's going to be a minister. And so she is sexually so humiliated by his rejection, she comes to feel hatred for herself. So I'm dealing with a wounded woman. Now you say you don't like her, but once again, I'm not dealing with, you know, Wonder Woman or paragons of perfection. I'm dealing with human beings who may be wounded, and so they may seem not likable. But if you understand where she comes from and what was done to her, as not that unusual in the 1950s, that women found themselves married to men who were using them to seem like normal men, but they weren't really interested in women. And so there's a feeling of self-laceration and self-dismay. However, she does work her way through that in the course of the novel, and she marries a different man, and he's a social activist. He's interested in environmental issues. The novel is about much more than whether, you know, like a character. The novel is actually about the environmental disaster of Niagara Falls, New York. So the novel, The Falls, is about the fall of man. It's about the fall of nature, the pollution of a beautiful place like Niagara Falls by industry. And that was the first national disaster area declared, I think it was by maybe Jimmy Carter, I think. So I grew up near Niagara Falls, and I've always been interested in that, the pollution of natural beauty by industry. And now Niagara Falls is like a shell of the place it had once was. It's sort of depopulated. It's a little bit like Detroit. But in writing a novel that has these, I guess you could say, political ambitions and wanting to write about the environment, not every character in the novel would be a likable character. As in real life, many social activists and revolutionaries are strong, outspoken, annoying people. You know, they may, in the civil rights era, there may have been people who are nonviolent, but they were not afraid to stand up and give speeches that were very strong, and many people hated them for disrupting the status quo. So they weren't likable people, but they were doing something that was considered moral and ethical and courageous. So I tend to want to write about people like that.
Let me preface this by saying I'm not very familiar with most of your works, but it's something that struck me curiously. I was curious about this. But you talked a lot about time in your readings, and even wrote a novel on time travel. And I guess my question is, how has the time, our own time, affected your writing? Because I know you've been writing for 50 years or so, and I was wondering how that has affected your time, your writing from the beginning to, say, now.
How time has affected my writing?
Yeah, so the change in time and how...
Change in time.
The 60s is not very similar to the time now, is I guess what I'm trying to get at.
Well, the 60s in many ways are still with us. I think it was the 1950s that were very different. The 1960s were the time of extreme social division. The generations were somewhat at war with each other. Today, America, the United States, is quite divisive and polarized, very much the way it was in the 1960s. During the reign of Richard Nixon, is very much during the reign of Trump, some of the same political fissures and seismic shiftings in the political body are going on. So really the late 1960s, early 1970s are very much analogous to the time now, the time of Watergate. One could say that we're going through like a second Watergate right now. But also the division in the 1960s was more generational, like generations. Older people generally, not all of them at all, but generally were in favor of the Vietnam War. Younger people were pretty much opposed to the Vietnam War. It was a pretty clear division. So young people in college, young men, if there are young men in this room who were college age right now, you would have all received a draft number. You were going to be drafted in the war. So this went through the generation, like electric bolt. People suddenly didn't take war just as some abstraction. They felt that they would have to maybe go and fight. One extreme is Muhammad Ali. When he refused to be drafted. He said, "I'm not going to go fight the Vietnam. They never did anything to me. I'm not going to be sent all the way over to Vietnam to kill some other poor people, like the people I come from." So it was a time of great social unrest, which is very much like the time. Actually very much like time today. And the feeling of anti-science, the feeling that some people don't even want to talk about climate control, but younger people tend to want to talk about doing something about climate change and so forth. So I would say actually some predominant themes in American history prevail through the decades. But the roles of women and girls have definitely changed. And I think that's so enlightening and so exciting for, not only for women and girls, but for men also, because it just sort of raises consciousness and makes many more things possible that were not possible previously. So I feel very optimistic about the future. I think the immediate time now is difficult, and there's a lot of polarization, but I think that maybe, in a couple of years, there might be much more harmony. And that, the younger generation may be the ones who come together rather than being polarized like older generations. They may actually come together with a common necessity of wanting to save the planet and being concerned for endangered species and maybe gun control and things like that are not so popular with the older electorate. Maybe one more question?
Hi. I've known about you my whole life, being an English major, but what really drew me back to you was your Twitter feed. You were recommended as somebody to follow, and I love your posts, and I'm just curious, why you've chosen that platform and what you're doing kind of with your Twitter feed with that.
Well, I think the Twitter is very ephemeral and transient, and I think of books as a little more permanent. So to me, the printed word has primacy, and anything on social media is just really fleeting and fading. It can have momentary or daily, It could last a while, but basically it's not a permanent medium, so I don't pay too much attention to it, really. But when I started out as in, I think, 2011, my publisher suggested that I go onto Twitter. At that time, Twitter was very different. There were not so many people on Twitter. There was a lot of joking and a lot of people who are maybe just putting notices up. Like if a writer was going to visit a bookstore or give a lecture, you put a notice up. If a musician was going somewhere, and one of the most popular people in those days was Steve Martin. He was an early and brilliant, really, really funny Twitter writer. Steve has since faded away, and he doesn't participate very much. But in those days, it was very funny. There were a lot of jokes, and the mood of Twitter was very ebullient and sort of upbeat. Then with the campaign of 2016, the United States became polarized. Now, that really happened fairly clearly. I'm not just saying it. I mean, it really happened very clearly. So now there's Twitter like red state Twitter, blue state Twitter, and people who don't like one another, who block one another, who never read one another's tweets. But in the early days, it was almost like, you know, the Garden of Eden, where people weren't making enemies. They were just sort of much more fun. So that's what I started out, and my publisher said, well, I'll set it up for you. I said, well, I'm not at all interested really in social media or Facebook either. He said, well, let me set it up for you so when you go to give a lecture in, say, San Francisco, you could just say a notice, and then people will show up and people read the tweets, and they do actually. There's usually somebody who knows about it only through Twitter. But then when I got on Twitter, as time went on, I started reading tweets from parts of American consciousness I never knew existed. So I don't want to go into it in great detail, but like animal rights, animal liberation, the respect for animals, the saving of animals, just dealing with the whole animal world was not organized before this, but once you go onto Twitter or social media, you make connections. So, I mean, I follow Peter Singer, for instance, the man who really, he's like started the revolution of animal rights. So that's one thing I'm interested in. To me, Twitter is a lifesaver because I could never make contact with all those people. So I give money to some of those causes, and I subscribe to magazines and so forth, which everybody does on Twitter. It's nothing unusual. Then another aspect of Twitter is women's rights and feminism generally. Then the Me Too movement is very much a part of the social media. And also police brutality, surveillance all around the country, what we might call social justice, awareness of things that are unjust, parts of the country that you don't even know exist. The New York Times is a newspaper that we read back in Princeton, but the New York Times can only cover like a tiny fraction of all the news that's going on. And so Twitter and social media, if you choose carefully and try not to get fake news or, you know, really insidious things, try to have objective news if you could find that. It's really like opening windows into other worlds. And for somebody who's mainly a print person and who loves books, the Twitter was surprising to me and illuminating. So thank you very much.
Great. I just wanted to thank our speaker, Joyce Carol Oates, again, and thank you all for coming tonight. A reminder that books and broadsides are for sale in the lobby. Ms. Oates will be available to sign books and broadsides, but due to the incoming storm and travel considerations and last-minute changes we need to make to address that, the book signing will be somewhat curtailed. So thank you again so much for joining us.